Welcome back to Hopetales. Today's story takes us inside a plane that seemed perfect, but hid a deadly secret, one that would tear it apart in midair. The morning of the flight began with a calmness that gave no hint of the storm hiding decades beneath. The metal skin of the aircraft, China Airlines Flight 611, a Boeing 747-200, stood tall on the airport ramp, its massive frame shimmering in the warm sunlight. It was a routine day, the kind pilots consider ordinary, the kind passengers never think twice about. Ground crews moved around the aircraft with quiet efficiency, unaware that the airplane they were preparing carried a secret. Deep within its structure, a secret born. 22 years earlier, the 747 had flown thousands of hours. It had crossed oceans, survived storms, and endured more landings than anyone could count. Yet inside the metal, fatigue had been creeping silently. A hidden weakness lay just beneath the rear fuselage skin, a weakness caused by an improper repair long ago. It was a repair that looked fine on the outside, a repair that passed inspections, a repair that everyone trusted. But the metal behind it had begun to crack, slowly, invisibly, relentlessly. As the final checks were completed, the crew prepared the aircraft for departure. The engines rumbled to life, sending vibrations through the ground as the jet gently rolled away from the gate. Inside, families settled into their seats, business travelers reviewed documents, and children gazed out of the windows at the shrinking airport terminal. Everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. Flight 611 lifted into the sky with the grace of a giant bird, climbing steadily through layers of warm air. The coastline drifted below, fading slowly into the distance as the aircraft settled into its cruise altitude. The sea beneath sparkled, clouds drifted lazily, and the horizon stretched endlessly in soft shades of blue. To the passengers, the flight felt routine. They relaxed into the rhythm of the journey. But within the tail of the aircraft, forces were awakening. With every minute at high altitude, pressure built inside the cabin. The fuselage expanded ever so slightly, as it was designed to do. But in the region where the old repair had been made, the metal could no longer distribute the stress evenly. A small crack, once invisible, had grown wider. It had been growing for years, slowly, patiently. The repair from decades earlier had only covered the damaged area. It had not removed the internal structural weakness. Over time, each flight added microscopic damage. Each pressurization cycle was like a silent blow to the weakened metal. Inspectors had checked the aircraft many times. The repair looked acceptable. Manuals had been followed. Nothing seemed wrong. The danger remained hidden, like a shadow behind bright light. As Flight 611 cruised peacefully at altitude, air rushed past the fuselage at hundreds of miles per hour. Tiny vibrations pulsed through the aircraft. Ordinary, harmless on a healthy structure. But inside the weakened area, the vibrations began to combine with pressure to create a deadly combination. The crack expanded another fraction of an inch, then another. The metal fibers strained against forces they were never meant to handle. The structure held together because it had always held together. But the limits were nearing, high above the earth. The aircraft cut through the sky with majestic calm. Passengers read books, gazed out at the endless ocean, or closed their eyes in quiet rest. The cabin lights glowed softly. The engines hummed in steady harmony. The atmosphere on board felt safe, controlled, and almost peaceful. Yet beneath the calm interior, physics was setting the stage for an irreversible chain of events. The weakened fuselage section had now reached a point where even a slight increase in pressure could push it beyond its final threshold. Metal fatigue is a slow enemy, patient, steady, deadly. It hides until the moment conditions align, and then it strikes without warning. And on this flight, the alignment was almost complete. The old repair patch rode over the weakened structure like a fragile shield that had been failing for years. The airplane had flown countless hours after the repair. Each hour had been one step closer to disaster, but no inspector had seen the danger. No manual had highlighted the flaw. No checklist had raised a warning. The aircraft carried its fatal flaw silently, just as it did today. Far below, the ocean stretched endlessly. Waves rolled beneath the clouds in rhythmic patterns, unaware of the human drama unfolding above. The aircraft cruised onward, stable and smooth. The passengers continued their quiet routines, unaware that high stresses deep within the fuselage were tightening like a coiled spring. Every moment at altitude increased the tension. Air pressure inside the cabin pushed outward, trying to expand the weakened metal. Air pressure outside pushed inward, creating a constant strain. The aircraft's skin held firm, but the crack beneath it grew wider with each passing minute. It reached a size that transformed it from a crack into a structural threat, yet nothing outside reflected the danger inside. The engines performed perfectly. The wings carried the aircraft effortlessly. The cockpit instrumentation showed normal readings. There was no smoke, no vibration, no strange sound to hint at the approaching catastrophe. The airplane behaved like a perfectly functioning machine, while deep within, the final stage of structural failure was quietly preparing to unfold. Thousands of flights pass through skies like these every day without incident. Aircraft are designed to withstand extreme conditions, and repairs are governed by strict procedures. But when one mistake survives inspections and becomes part of the aircraft's skeleton, time becomes its enemy. For Flight 611, time was running out. As the aircraft continued its flawless cruise, it approached the moment where decades of hidden fatigue would reach critical level. The metal that had carried millions of pounds of pressure over its lifetime had finally reached the point where it could endure no more. The peaceful skies outside did not reveal it. The calm cabin did not feel it. The cockpit instruments did not show it. But the aircraft itself knew, in the way metal knows when it can no longer bend without breaking. And in that silent, invisible moment, the stage was set for what would soon become one of the most tragic and shocking mid-air disintegrations in aviation history. The calm before the unimaginable had arrived. Flight 611 continued its journey across the sky with the dignity of a giant that had conquered the world for decades. From the outside, the aircraft looked flawless. White fuselage gleaming, engines humming in smooth rhythm, wings slicing through the atmosphere with practiced ease. Everything appeared normal. Everything felt safe. But deep within the structure, the past was beginning to awaken. Many years before this flight, the aircraft had suffered a tailstrike during landing. The damage had been repaired quickly, following procedures that were considered acceptable at the time. Yet the repair had not removed the damaged portion of the fuselage. Instead, it covered the weakened area with a patch, sealing the surface but not removing the underlying cracks. It was a repair that looked right, passed inspections, and satisfied manuals, but left a weakness buried beneath metal layers. Over the years, the aircraft had flown thousands of flights. Each pressurization cycle had put stress on the repaired area. With every climb into thin air, the cabin pressurized. With every descent, the pressure dropped. This cycle, repeated day after day, year after year, worked like an invisible hammer striking the same point over and over again. The crack grew slowly, almost gently. At first microscopic, then measurable, eventually dangerous, yet nobody saw it. Nobody expected that a repair done decades earlier would become the seed of a tragedy. Aircraft maintenance teams trusted the old repair. Routine inspections showed nothing alarming. To everyone, the aircraft was healthy, a dependable veteran of the skies. As Flight 611 cruised at altitude, the invisible crack reached a point where it no longer behaved. Like a simple fracture, it had expanded to a length where the surrounding structure was being forced to carry loads it was never designed to handle. With each passing second, the aircraft's skin stretched slightly outward under cabin pressure. Normally, this was harmless. The fuselage was built to flex. But in the weakened area, that flex became a slow, lethal tear. Inside the cabin, passengers continued their routines. Some slept, some read. Others gazed out at the majestic blue horizon. The cabin remained peaceful, steady, almost dreamlike. Nothing hinted at the forces gathering in the hidden layers of metal behind them. There were no vibrations, no unusual noises, no warning signs. The aircraft was still performing flawlessly. In the tail section, however, stress patterns formed like shifting currents. The old repair patch struggled to carry the load. Years of fatigue had eaten away at the edges, turning strong aluminum into a brittle, vulnerable shell. One more flight shouldn't have been a problem, but this was the flight where pressure, age, and the size of the crack had reached their combined limit. Air rushed over the fuselage at immense speed, creating constant external pressure. Inside, the pressurized cabin pushed outward. Between these forces, the weakened section became the battleground. The crack widened another millimeter, then another. It was no longer a hidden wound. It was becoming a structural failure, yet the aircraft remained silent. Engines roared with steady confidence. The wings glided effortlessly. The cockpit instruments showed normal readings. The airplane behaved like a perfectly healthy machine. The danger remained invisible to everyone on board. Far below, the ocean glittered under the sun. Clouds drifted beneath the aircraft, forming shadows on the water. From the cockpit, the view seemed peaceful, miles of sky and sea stretching endlessly. Stability surrounded the flight from every direction, but inside the tail, the final moments of structural integrity were quietly unfolding. Flight 611's fuselage was built to endure extraordinary stress, but even the strongest materials have limits when weakened. The crack, now long enough to threaten the integrity of the airframe, reached what engineers call critical length. At this point, crack growth becomes rapid, unstoppable. It moves faster than the human eye could ever detect a violent, splitting motion accelerated by pressure and speed. The aircraft was still cruising steadily, unaware of the internal war being waged. Passengers remained comfortable, the cabin lights steady, the air smooth. The trust humans place in aircraft is built on decades of engineering excellence. And, most of the time, it is deserved. But the one weakness no one expected was now deciding the fate of Flight 611. As the plane moved deeper into its flight path, vibrations from airflow intensified slightly, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to push the crack further along its deadly journey. Metal that had held together for decades suddenly found itself unable to withstand one more increment of force. The patch that had masked the damage for years was nearing its final moment of resistance. In the tail section, pressure continued to rise and fall with the rhythm of the aircraft. The environment was calm, but the metal was reaching its limit. Then, silently, almost invisibly, the crack expanded faster than ever before. Once it reached its final threshold, nature took over. Metal fatigue is a predictable enemy once the critical point is reached. Failure becomes inevitable. But even as the crack approached the point of no return, the world inside the cabin remained normal. Passengers shifted in their seats. The crew continued their duties. The engines performed with flawless precision. Everything from the outside appeared perfectly controlled. The past had finally caught up with the present. The one mistake from decades earlier, an incomplete repair, had grown from a tiny flaw into a fatal weakness. And now, during this routine flight, the pressure cycles, speed, and altitude had aligned in a way that made structural failure unavoidable. Yet no alarms had sounded. No warning lights had activated. There was no hint of what was about to happen. The aircraft appeared strong, stable, invincible, even as the weakened metal reached its breaking point. The story of Flight 611 was about to change forever. A moment of catastrophic failure was approaching, a moment that no one on board could sense. But that aviation history would never forget. The sky outside remained calm. The cabin remained peaceful. But within the tail of the aircraft, the final seconds of structural integrity were silently ticking away. The aircraft glided across the sky with quiet confidence, unaware that every second brought it closer to the limit of its strength. Flight 611 moved through smooth air, its wings steady, its engines perfect, its passengers calm. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. Nothing hinted at the silent collapse forming deep inside the tail section. The sky around the jet remained open, peaceful, and endless, a deceptive calm. Inside the fuselage structure, however, nature had begun its irreversible march. The crack from the old repair had grown beyond safety. It stretched along the fuselage skin like a quiet scar splitting, wider with each breath of pressurized air. Decades of accumulated damage now turned into rapid mechanical breakdown. The aluminum alloy, once strong and resilient, had thinned to the point of fragility. A force it once would have easily resisted had now become overwhelming. Flight 611 moved through the air at high speed, and the airflow exerted tremendous pressure along the fuselage. Combined with the internal cabin pressurization, the weakened structure was caught between two opposing forces. Metal strained. Rivets held on with their final grip. The old repair patch, once a shield, had become a trap, weakening the surrounding material with every cycle over the years. The aircraft continued forward, oblivious to the fact that the balance between integrity and collapse had tipped. Structural failure did not begin with a loud warning. It started with a tiny ripple, a sudden, microscopic shift in the metal, a tremor too small for any human to sense. That movement triggered a chain reaction. The crack accelerated with frightening speed, traveling along the fuselage like lightning, splitting the metal in a fraction of a second. Outside, the aircraft's shadow glided across the ocean. Inside, the passengers continued to relax. Some slept. Some stretched their legs. Some leaned against the windows, watching clouds scroll below them like drifting islands. The cabin lighting felt warm, comforting, steady. Nobody sensed that the aircraft was reaching the moment, when its structure could no longer endure. Then it happened. The crack reached a critical point where the pressure inside the aircraft could no longer be contained. Metal that had been stretched to its limit finally gave way. A tearing force burst outward from the weakened repair area. The fuselage skin, once a smooth shield against the sky, violently split apart. In an instant, the aircraft, which had flown flawless for decades, began to break open. The structural failure spread rapidly, faster than the blink of an eye. A section of the tail fuselage tore away. Once the skin ruptured, pressurized air inside the cabin shot outward with explosive force. The breakup was sudden and catastrophic, a chain of failures unfolding in milliseconds. The aircraft started to disintegrate, not because of any action from the crew, not because of the engines or weather, but because the metal itself could no longer hold together. The pressure differential between the inside and outside triggered a rapid and devastating collapse. The forces that aircraft engineers design against were now multiplied to destructive levels due to the structural weakness. Pieces of the aircraft's tail separated first, scattering through the sky. The rupture widened, causing the fuselage to lose its aerodynamic stability. The airflow, once smooth around the aircraft's body, now crashed into jagged openings, amplifying the destruction. The structure was no longer a unified shell. It had become a fragile chain of fragments. The engines continued to run, unaware of the collapse behind them. The wings still generated lift for a brief moment. But the tail, critical for stability and control, was compromised beyond recovery. Without it, the aircraft's center of balance shifted violently. The remaining fuselage, twisted under aerodynamic loads it could no longer handle. Inside the cabin, everything changed in an instant. The calm environment turned into violent turbulence. The sudden decompression ripped through the interior. The cabin lights flickered as the aircraft's system struggled. Objects that had rested peacefully moments before were now flying freely through the air. The structure around the passengers trembled under the force of the disintegration. The air inside the aircraft rushed outward, pulling everything with it. High above the ocean, the aircraft's breakup continued. Sections of the fuselage separated as aerodynamic forces exploited. Every weakness created by the expanding crack. The tail cone detached. Panels ripped away. The vertical stabilizer separated in the chaos. What had begun as a small fatigue, crack had triggered one of the most violent structural failures in commercial aviation history. The final moments of the aircraft were a combination of physical forces the machine could not survive. The breakup released enormous amounts of energy, spreading debris across the sky. The ocean below remained calm, unaware of the tragedy unfolding above. The sky, minutes earlier a picture of serenity, now held fragments of a disintegrating 747 scattered in different directions. The catastrophic failure was not a random event. It was the result of a slow, silent buildup that had been growing for decades, a mistake in the past, returning with devastating consequences. A repair meant to protect had instead concealed the danger, allowing the crack to spread hidden from sight, hidden from maintenance crews, hidden from the crew and passengers. In the final seconds, the aircraft no longer resembled the majestic machine that had taken off earlier. It was helpless in the face of physics. Once the structural integrity failed, recovery became impossible. Unlike mechanical failures that give warnings, structural disintegration offers no chance to respond. No time to correct, no window for reaction. The aircraft was now in free fall, fragmented, broken, and defeated by a flaw everyone had forgotten. Far below, the ocean waited, unaware of the tragedy descending from the sky. The story of Flight 611 had reached its darkest moment, a moment defined not by weather or human error, but by a silent enemy that had lived inside the aircraft for decades. Time. Yet from this tragedy would rise lessons that would save thousands of future lives. Flight 611 had fallen, but aviation would never again ignore the hidden dangers of aging repairs. The investigation into Flight 611's disintegration became one of the most haunting tasks aviation experts had ever faced. What lay scattered across the ocean was not just twisted metal and fractured memories, but a story that stretched back more than 2 decades. A story buried in old maintenance logs, overlooked repair procedures, and a single wound on an airplane that never truly healed. As the debris was collected from the Taiwan Strait, investigators began forming a picture of the final minutes. The tail section, once towering proudly at the back of the 747, was found shattered in pieces. Some fragments were pressed inward, others violently torn outward, revealing the direction of the forces that destroyed them. Every scrap of metal spoke of overwhelming pressure, the kind no aircraft structure could withstand unless it was already weakened long before that day. The search for the origin of that weakness led them deep into the history of the plane. The aircraft, delivered in the early 1980s, had flown millions of miles, but somewhere along those miles, hidden from passengers and forgotten by most, a serious incident had occurred. Years before Flight 611, the same aircraft had experienced a tailstrike during landing, a moment where the tail hit the runway with enough force to damage the rear fuselage. It should have been a routine repair, carefully documented, thoroughly inspected, completed with precision. But what investigators found stunned them. The repair from that old tailstrike had not been done according to Boeing's exact specifications. Instead of replacing an entire damaged panel, technicians had used a doubler plate, a temporary reinforcement, meant only for very specific circumstances. The structure was patched, not restored. The metal beneath the repair remained unseen, aging, and slowly cracking with every takeoff and landing that followed. For years, the weakness spread silently. No one on board Flight 611 could have imagined that a hidden scar was waiting beneath layers of metal, preparing to give way at cruising altitude. As investigators reconstructed the wreckage in a massive hangar, the truth became clearer. The old repair had allowed a phenomenon called multi-site fatigue cracking to develop. Tiny cracks, almost invisible to the naked eye, spread outward from the damaged area like lines on aging skin. Over time, these cracks grew longer, deeper, and more dangerous. Flight after flight, the fuselage expanded and contracted with pressure changes. Each expansion pushed the cracks further, each contraction pulled them apart, until the day came when the pressure of cruising altitude was simply too much. When the fuselage failed, the collapse was instantaneous. The rear portion of the aircraft lost its structural integrity, tearing away from the rest of the plane. The massive forces of decompression ripped through the cabin, and the aircraft broke apart with unimaginable speed. The smooth sky through which the 747 had been peacefully, flying only moments earlier, became the setting for one of the most devastating mid-air disintegrations in aviation history. Yet, the story did not end there. After identifying the flawed repair, investigators had to confront the implications. For more than 2 decades, this aircraft had flown with a silent, growing threat. Hundreds of maintenance checks, thousands of hours of operation, and still, the crucial weakness had remained undiscovered. It was not just a story about metal fatigue, but about how easily a mistake could hide in plain sight within a complicated system. A single incorrect repair, performed years earlier, had unknowingly placed countless lives at risk. As the findings were shared, airlines around the world took immediate action. Similar aircraft were inspected. Maintenance procedures were revised. Manuals were updated to make sure no critical repair could ever be overlooked or undocumented again. Inspectors were trained to spot signs of fatigue that older techniques might have missed. Regulators strengthened rules around patch repairs, ensuring that temporary solutions were not used where permanent replacements were required. The legacy of Flight 611 became a global reminder of the importance of precision, transparency, and vigilance in aviation safety. Back in Taiwan, families mourned the loss of their loved ones, holding on to memories that could never be replaced. The sea that had swallowed the aircraft became a symbol of unanswered questions, but also of the relentless effort to understand what truly happened. Investigators never treated the wreckage as mere metal. To them, every piece represented a life, a voice, a story, and their mission was to give those stories the truth they deserved. In the years that followed, memorials were built and anniversaries observed. The story of Flight 611 was told not as a tale of failure, but as a catalyst for change. Aviation is built upon learning, and every mistake, every close call, every tragedy leaves behind a lesson. And Flight 611's most powerful lesson was that even the smallest oversight could have consequences far beyond imagination. Yet amidst the tragedy, one more theme emerged, one aligned perfectly with the spirit of Hopetales. The hope was not in the disaster itself, but in what humanity did after it. The aircraft may have been lost, but its story saved lives. The improvements made because of this investigation helped protect millions of passengers who would fly in the decades to come. A catastrophe transformed into a beacon of awareness, responsibility, and progress. The truth behind Flight 611's disintegration was heartbreaking, but it was not meaningless. Every correction, every revised manual, every new training program became a tribute to those who were on board. The aviation world honored them not with words but with action, by building a safer future. And so the final chapter of Flight 611's story is not just about what caused it to fall apart, but how its legacy helped ensure others would stay together. It is a reminder that even in the darkest skies, lessons can shine through, that from tragedy, determination can rise. And that hope often takes the form of change, precise, powerful, and lasting. With that, the story of Flight 611 becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a commitment to safety, a promise carried forward by every aircraft that now flies with stronger inspections, stricter maintenance, and deeper understanding. The passengers lost that day are remembered not only in grief, but in every life saved because their story was told. A story of truth, a story of learning, a story of hope through change.